So moving on to question number 7, let us read it first. In the late 1800s, Spanish language newspapers flourished in cities across Texas. San Antonio alone produced 11 newspapers in Spanish between 1890 and 1900, but El Paso surpassed all other cities in the state. This city produced 22 newspapers in Spanish during that period. El Paso is located on the border with Mexico and has always had a large population of Spanish speakers. Thus, it is unsurprising that this city became such a rich site for Spanish language journalism. Which choice best states the main purpose of the text? Is it A, to compare Spanish language newspapers published in Texas today with ones published there during the late 1800s? B, to explain that Spanish language newspapers thrived in Texas and especially in El Paso during the late 1800s. C, to argue that Spanish language newspapers published in El Paso influenced the ones published in San Antonio during the late 1800s. Or D, to explain why Spanish language newspapers published in Texas were so popular in Mexico during the late 1800s. So which do you think it is? If you said B, congratulations, that's the correct answer. Now, B is the best answer because it most accurately describes the main purpose of the text. So, the text begins by stating that there were many Spanish language. So, they're talking about Spanish language flourished. There were lots of them. There were many Spanish language newspapers in cities across Texas in the late 1800s. So, they're talking about Texas 1800s and Spanish language newspapers flourishing. And then citing San Antonio as the city that produced 11 such newspapers. In fact, San Antonio alone produced 11 such newspapers. The text then goes on to note that in El Paso, there were 22 newspapers published in Spanish in the late 1800s. Then El Paso, it's producing 22 newspapers in Spanish during that period. So the text then goes on to note that El Paso, there were 22 newspapers published in Spanish in the late 1800s, more than any other Texas city. The text then concludes by explaining that the reason for this large number of Spanish language newspapers was likely El Paso's location near Mexico and its large population of Spanish speakers. Therefore, the main purpose of the text is to explain that Spanish language newspapers thrived in Texas cities, especially in El Paso in the late 1800s. So, because they are so close to the Mexico, the border, El Paso is located on the border with Mexico. That's why so many Spanish language newspapers are there. And A is not correct because A says to compare Spanish language newspapers published in Texas today and the ones published there during the late 1800s. This is incorrect because the text doesn't discuss Spanish language newspapers published in Texas today, let alone compare them with the newspapers that were published in the 1800s. It's not even talking about the newspapers published in Texas today. So that can't be. And then C, to argue that Spanish language newspapers published in El Paso influenced the ones published in San Antonio. This is not correct because although the text characterizes El Paso as a particularly rich state for Spanish language journalism in the late 1800s, the text doesn't discuss whether newspapers published in El Paso influenced the newspapers published in other cities across Texas, including San Antonio. So it's not talking about the influence or anything. Then D is incorrect because the text doesn't mention whether Spanish language newspapers published in Texas were also widely read in Mexico. The text only focuses on the popularity of Spanish language newspapers within Texas and especially in El Paso. So we're so popular in Mexico. We are not talking about the newspapers of Mexico. They are talking about the newspapers in Texas. So although El Paso is located on the border with Mexico, it doesn't mean that the Spanish language newspapers are being read in Mexico or they were popular in Mexico. So